All right, it looks like we are live. I'm going to give it a second for Facebook to catch up and to make sure that our live is actually going live. So if you're just hopping on, if you can hear my voice and see my screen, it'd be great if you could just drop us something in the comments, give us a thumbs up, give us a smile emoji or something like that so we know that we're coming through loud and clear. We're going to give it just a minute to make sure that everybody gets caught up and signed on. So I appreciate your patience as we get rolling here. You guys are just hopping on. We're just getting started. We're going to have our Facebook Live here in just a moment talking about how wrestlers can prepare in the off season to dominate the season that's coming up and all the fueling and all the good stuff that goes into that. So it looks like our live is working. So let's go ahead and get things kicked off. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's interview. I'm joined today by registered dietitian Jackie Slomin. How you doing today, Jackie?
Hey, good. No complaints. Friday, so doing awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to be your host today, Grayson Carter. I'm founder of Nutritionist Near Me. It's a website where we help connect health-conscious people with local practitioners. And I'm really excited today to get to interview Jackie and hear about more of the work that she's doing with wrestlers, helping them make weight without having to use aggressive cutting techniques. So let's just do a sound check for just a second. If you guys are watching this live, if you could drop something in the comments to let us know that you can hear us, that would be great. We're going to monitor that. Also, we're going to be doing a little bit of Q&A at the end. We have a handful of questions loaded up that people have typed in, so we're going to address those with Jackie. But if you have questions that come up along the way, drop them in the comments, and we're going to try to get through as many as we can at the end of this today. So don't be afraid to ask your most burning questions, and we'll try to get to them at the end. If you hear anybody, or if you hear something that you think of somebody, like if you know other wrestlers or something comes up and you're like, hey, I know somebody that needs to hear this, please don't be afraid to tag them in the comments. The more people that we can reach, the more people that we can help. So don't be afraid to reach out to somebody if you think that they need to hear what we're talking about today. So let's just go ahead and jump right into it. Jackie, I appreciate you being here today. Let's just get right into it. So tell me a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hey, yeah, for sure. So for those of you guys tuning in, my name is Jackie Slomin. I am a sports dietitian and founder of the Roman Protocol. And what that is the process that I use with wrestlers to help them make weight without starving, spitting, sweating, pretty much all those aggressive cutting techniques, even if they have 5 or 10 pounds to lose for their match.
That's awesome. So I know kind of our topic today is going to be kind of more focused on the off season. From what I understand, a lot of the seasons or the tournaments have kind of been winding down. And so now people are thinking about off season training and getting ready for the next year. So with that in mind, what should people be focusing on? What should wrestlers be focusing on right now in order to make the most of their time right now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So it really depends where you are in your season or what you're doing. So for wrestlers that are wrestling year round, I know obviously high school season ended. A lot of wrestlers are kind of participating in Greco. So if you've got stuff like that coming up, or you're participating in things like Fargo or Disney Duels in the next few months, kind of the emphasis should be on not only having a weigh-in strategy so that you can dominate those competitions, but also figuring out how to maintain and improve your strength during that off time now that your practices aren't as intensive.
Got it. So when it comes to keeping their mass and their strength, what can they be doing for that?
Yeah, so the one thing I always tell wrestlers to follow in terms of trying to maximize their strength is actually something called the 1.5% rule. And essentially what that is a guideline for how wrestlers can kind of maximize their strength and their body composition while they are getting ready for those matches and those tournaments. And pretty much just a quick snippet of what that is the 1.5% rule is pretty much this standard that we use. And what it is that wrestlers actually can't lose more than about 1.5% of their total weight in any given week without losing a significant amount of muscle mass. So that is kind of the basis of what I recommend most wrestlers follow when they are training. And this way we can not only maximize their strength and their training, but we can make sure that they're making the most out of it as far as accumulating that muscle mass.
Got it. So so just so I understand, so the 1.5% rule, if I'm 100 pounds, I can lose about 1.5 pounds, and that was per week.
Yeah, and that's a maximum. So that's
Got
not
it.
necessarily the number that we always want to aim for, but that is the absolute maximum that we should be aiming for.
Got it. So if I have less than that, I'm guessing I can kind of do the math when I have a certain amount of time and I know I have a certain amount of weight to lose, that we can calculate that and figure out if I'm going to be able to do it without losing strength and muscle mass. Is that what am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, that's exactly it. We get that number and then we work backwards, and this way there's no panic or kind of rushing towards when we do have to make that weigh-in process. So it just makes the process really simple and stress-free.
Got it. So let's talk a little bit about, I know it's a hot topic right now, some of the, I guess we'll call them the traditional cutting techniques that are pretty common in the industry that people have been using for, well, probably decades now, with, starving, sweating, like doing these brutal workouts, wearing, 5 layers of clothes, going in saunas, taking salt baths, that's a pretty, it seems to be permeating throughout the entire industry. Why are those not necessarily the best strategies to be using? Like what's that actually doing to somebody's body when they're using those strategies?
Yeah, so there's really kind of two things that happen. So kind of just falling back on our 1.5% rule for wrestlers that are starving and restricting calories to try to make weight. We're essentially just like taking the principle we just mentioned and we're throwing it out the window. So when you are rapidly losing weight that way, again, we're losing muscle mass. But then the other part of that is a lot of those techniques that you just mentioned and a lot of what people do is trying to manipulate water weight, but they're really doing it the wrong way and a really inefficient and unhealthy way. So the traditional methods like the sweating, the spitting, the saunas, the salt baths, everything that comes with it, your body is actually losing what is referred to as extracellular fluid when they do that. And extracellular fluid is actually the water that our body needs for its organs, its kidney function, pretty much all that good stuff it needs to stay healthy and maintain its homeostasis. So when we're losing that, it's dramatically affecting a wrestler's performance. It's giving us those dehydration symptoms like that fatigue and that lack of energy and strength and brain fog on the mat. And just really in general, it drags out the process as well. So most wrestlers, when they are using those techniques to make weight, it's typically a process that takes 4 or 5 or even a few weeks to get down that way. So they are suffering and struggling throughout that entire time.
Got it. So you mentioned extracellular water, and that's where like most of these traditional, strategies are using. Where is it possible to lose water weight without it having to affect the performance?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of exactly what I teach wrestlers. So kind of the opposite of what extracellular water weight is actually trying to lose intracellular. And intracellular fluid is kind of like the spare tire of a car, so to speak. So it's something that if we manipulate in the right way, and we do that a few different ways, so specific hydration protocol, specific diet protocol, and just kind of tailoring it to that wrestler and their training and their sweat needs, we do lose that intracellular fluid instead. And we can get rid of that temporarily without it affecting our performance, without having those signs and symptoms of dehydration, and essentially kind of just skipping that process where wrestlers have to starve and be miserable for 10, 20, 30 hours a week to make weight.
Got it. So make sure I understand you correctly. Excuse me. So our body's storing this water. Our body stores water in 2 different ways, is what it sounds like. We have our extracellular and our intracellular water, but our body uses those differently, right? And so when we pull it from one, that can affect our performance. But it sounds like if we're pulling it from intracellular water, like that's not going to have the same sort of performance decrease if we're doing it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And also when we do manipulate intracellular water and we do it the right way, that water loss can actually happen really rapidly in about 24 hours. So we effectively get rid of those performance decreases, but we also really shorten down the period of time that a wrestler does need to be essentially cutting weight, so to speak.
That sounds nice. So instead of having to be starving for the week leading up to the tournament, they can drop the weight kind of at the last minute. They can probably train harder leading up to the tournament because they don't have to be in this deficit leading up to it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, no, for sure. You know, everyone's a little different, but most wrestlers that I speak to and the people that I work with, they always tell me when they are preparing before a weigh-in and before getting ready for a big tournament, their focus is just entirely on sweating and how many calories they can burn, and their mind is just so far away from their actual training and technique and just really improving what they're doing on the mat, so we can kind of completely switch that focus for them.
That's really interesting. So not being a wrestler myself, like I played, football and basketball and stuff growing up, and those were sports that didn't, we didn't have to worry about our weight. Like we could pack on as many pounds, we could lift weights, we could be as big as we wanted, and we were able to focus on just competing, like being the best at what we had to do. So that's really interesting that it's almost like wrestling is, it sounds like it's 90% making weight. And then the last 10%, as soon as I make weight, okay, now I got to mentally prepare for the tournament. I'm guessing that's got to be tough to get your head in that space when your whole focus is just on like getting down to the right weight.
Yeah, and I think anyone would agree with me that those wrestlers that have kids that wrestling is a huge mental sport. And when their focus just, like you said, is entirely on making weight for those days or weeks leading up to a big tournament as opposed to getting better on the mat, it really does get in their head. And I've heard kids say that they've seen the other guy on the other side of the mat and they've essentially kind of given up or kind of told themselves that they're not as strong or as good performance wise. So they kind of give up before they even start in some cases.
That's tough. I remember that, having friends in high school that were tough as nails guys. And as soon as they started cutting, it just seemed like they were not the same. They were not the same people.
No, you get so one nice word for it's hangry, but you get the the mood swings, the personality changes, the irritability, the isolation. I'm so sure I can relate to a lot of parents when I say that wrestlers, they kind of will run home, shut the door to their room, and just want to be alone because they don't want to snap out on people. So definitely it's a big mental strain when they go through that old school cutting process for sure.
I can imagine. So let's talk a little bit about like tournament play. Probably a lot of people, preparing for big tournaments or even some of their smaller local tournaments. What can like somebody do? Or what should a wrestler be thinking about if they need to drop weight for a tournament, maybe do it multiple times in like a short period of time? Like, how should they be addressing that?
Yeah, so of course I always recommend people to do the Roman protocol. So that is kind of, as opposed to traditional cutting techniques, we're doing things like manipulating our sodium, our residue, our glycogen, following that hydration protocol, and really just focusing on their training and their ability to perform on and off the mat. Got it.
I just want to pause for a second. If this is resonating with you guys, drop me something in the comments. I just want to make sure that Jackie and I are touching on all the points that are going to be helpful to you guys. I'm monitoring the chat over here on Facebook. So, or if you just want to pop in and say hello, we'd love to hear from you as well. All right. So let's talk a little bit more like specifically on if somebody needs to drop weight, like what's a safe amount? Like where, I know we talked about the 1.5% rule at the beginning of the amount of weight that they can lose leading up to, or without the amount of weight that they can lose without losing muscle mass. Are there other things that they need to be taking into consideration when they're thinking about dropping weight for a tournament or for the season?
Yeah, so I guess there's kind of two different things to touch on there. So if you're dropping weight for specifically something like weight certifications where you just need to get down without losing that strength, then that is the 1.5% rule is exactly what I would follow. But if you are worried about losing weight for a tournament and you're trying to figure out the maximum amount of weight you can safely lose, so that is when we would use something like the Roman protocol. But typically, a wrestler can safely lose about 3 to 6% of their total body weight safely. So again, for a 100-pound wrestler, that would be about 3 to 6 pounds, and that's usually just the minimum. I don't like to overpromise and underdeliver. So certainly most people do more than that, but 3 to 6% is a pretty safe bet, especially if it's your first time kind of trying the process.
Got it. And I know a lot of people, just when we were talking a little bit beforehand, a big concern is, these parents are wanting to do what's best for their kids. And so they're certainly concerned that doing anything kind of different than like what their coach is promoting, they want to make sure that it's safe. So can you talk to like the safety aspect or the risks of cutting weight, like traditional methods, or using something like the Roman protocol that you mentioned?
Yeah, so I guess just to kind of touch on the traditional methods first, unfortunately, there are a lot of risks that come with it. So there's short-term and there's long-term. Obviously, the short-term risks are going to be that severe dehydration, which is, again, going to affect their energy, their performance. It can cause things like electrolyte imbalances, which can cause a whole slew of health risks. And just outside of the short terms, there are long-term things as well that do happen that unfortunately a lot of people don't want to talk about, or they're kind of just like, hey, like, that's great, totally get it, but not my kid. But the truth is that wrestlers that are cutting weight for extended periods of time, they do have lifelong problems usually, and it can be something like disordered eating or potentially an eating disorder. Obviously, that doesn't happen to everyone, but anyone in a weight class sport actually has double the risk of any other athlete. Things like increased risks of obesity due to weight cycling, cardiac issues. So there are definitely some risks that come with doing that traditional process over the long term. And then as far as risks for the Roman protocol, so obviously if you have a specific health condition, it's going to really depend on the individual. But for the most part, the process is really safe. As a dietitian, I would never do anything to harm it. First do no harm, then be effective. So because we're manipulating that intracellular water weight, it really does dramatically reduce any of those risks. We're not doing the starving and the sweating that usually lead to all of those other issues. But like with anything, I'm certain there is a small amount of risk that comes with anything. If you're a runner, you can sprain your ankle, running down the block, stub your toe. There's a risk with any sport, but we mitigate that as much as possible.
Got it. So I remember at least my experience in high school. Some of my coaches were pretty stubborn, and they were, again, they wanted what's best for me, but they wanted me to do it their way. So what would you say to parents that know that what their kid is doing may not be, they don't know exactly what isn't right, but they just feel like there has to be a better way than starving themselves all the time? What would you say to a parent, or what tools can you give them that if they have to have a conversation with a coach and they want to try something different, how should they approach that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So typically, this process will work no matter what you're doing, but typically the off season is the best time to try this process out, because if you don't have a tournament coming up right away, or you just are a little more relaxed, you can take this method, use it, perfect it, know it works, and then go to your coach with that. But with that said, if someone is just looking to learn more about the process in general and kind of see what it's all about so that they can kind of get in their head what the difference is, I actually do have a free training that I'm actually hosting on my website right now. It's so nutritiononthemat.com, and then just right in the menu button, there is a link that says free training, and it takes you through the entire process of what the Roman protocol is, how it's effective and how it's different. And then people can kind of make that choice if they think it's a good fit for them or not.
Got it. So just want to pause for a second. I see a couple of people signing on. Shirok, Anthony, great to have you guys here. I appreciate you typing your questions. We'll get to those in just a minute. So thank you for dropping those in there. Let's see. We still have a few more questions that people wrote in. So what about wrestlers that don't maybe have tournaments coming up? It's the off season. Maybe they're trying to relax a little bit, but they know that they're going to be competing at a lower weight class next year. What can they be doing to prepare for that?
Yeah. So that's exactly where we would take that 1.5% rule into play, like we were talking about. So if you're, let's say you're 12 weeks out from a tournament, and we use, let's say, again, I always go back to the 150 or 100-pound example. We can get that number and then work backwards based on how many weeks we have. So if you calculate your maximum weight loss per week to descend healthfully, and then kind of work backwards and come up with a plan, you can figure out exactly how many weeks it's going to take you to get there. And that is going to help us maximize our strength for the coming season. It's going to avoid that panic that usually sets in right before a weight certification. So it's usually like the first week or two before certs, for most people that's November. So we can avoid all of that and then not get into that rut where wrestlers get stuck using those starving and traditional weight cutting periods that will usually drain them, not only for certifications, but throughout the rest of the season. So if you've ever seen a snapshot, a before and after of a wrestler in the off season compared to kind of the mid or end of the regular season when they have been doing a lot of weight cutting, it's a little crazy and scary because you can see a physical difference in their body, and not only in their strength, but also just a visible difference in their muscle mass declining over the season as well. So we can completely avoid all of that by being prepared every step of the way.
Got it. So what about wrestlers that have to gain weight in the off season? I'm guessing, there's not everybody has to cut weight. So what should somebody be doing if they either want to wrestle up, or maybe they have to wrestle up, maybe just in order to get a spot on the team, they have to wrestle in a different weight class. What should they be thinking about?
Yeah. I know that's a great point because, people have to bump up or bump down all the time. Sometimes it's not always picture perfect. So for wrestlers that do need to gain weight, we kind of take our same 1.5% rule, but we just use it in the opposite manner. So again, if, as an example, if we know we can take the 1.5% rule and it says we can lose a maximum of, let's say, a pound a week. Same thing when you're trying to gain muscle mass. So we wouldn't want to gain more than a pound of weight per week, because what ends up happening is your body is actually storing a really large amount of body fat versus actually putting on muscle mass. So we can kind of take the same rule and just apply it in the opposite direction. So that way we have that gradual weight increase, but we are also, changing our body composition in a right way. And we're putting on as much lean mass as possible versus storing body fat, which is only going to hinder performance, not enhance it.
Got it. So it sounds like, our body, it kind of works in the same way, both directions. And so if we know where we need to get to, we need to make sure that we do it in a gradual process, or else, we're just going to be packing on fat pounds. Yeah,
absolutely.
Got it. So how would a wrestler, let's just say it's kind of open, they have a couple different weight classes, or maybe they're, between two. How should they know what weight class they should be wrestling in? Maybe next season, if they have an opportunity to change, or, they're just starting the sport. How can they decide where they're gonna fall?
Yeah. So it's really kind of a big personal decision. So unfortunately, there's no really one size fits all formula for determining who should be in what weight class, but a few different things that really do impact that are going to be things like the age and physical maturity of the wrestler. One thing I always just say and want to clarify is that when we're talking about weight cutting in any capacity, this is for high school ages and above mostly. We don't really endorse cutting weight at the youth level. Obviously, there are some exceptions when there's no choice, but so it depends on the age of the wrestler, the physical and mental maturity of the wrestler. And I think really parents and coaches would be able to determine this better than anyone, because they're going to know their kids and their athletes the best, their stature or their body composition. So obviously for a weigh-in, we're manipulating water weight only, and time, if we're doing it the right way, we're manipulating that intracellular water weight. So their body composition doesn't necessarily matter at that point. But if your wrestler is sitting at, 5 or 6% body fat naturally, and now you're trying to decide what weight class to get ready for certifications, that's really going to play a role in, how much lower or higher they can go. And then the other thing is really something that people just don't necessarily address often is what the wrestler's personal preferences. If you're telling someone that they have to cut weight and they are very against it, then they are going to be dragging all season. They're not going to be performing well, and they're probably going to be fighting you most of the way. And if you have a wrestler that is really adamant about bumping down to that weight class, there's not much you can do to change their mind on that end. So just kind of taking all of those factors into account, I think will really help you kind of figure out where you should be. And then obviously it's not always a perfect world. You don't always get to pick what weight class you're going to fall in. Sometimes there is only a spot lower. There's not a varsity spot higher, or the coach has to bump you up or bump you down. So it just really, it depends on so many factors,
Got it. So would, I have to imagine, like, especially in high school, like that can be a pretty pivotal point in like people's growth, like physically, right? Like I'm trying to remember, like I probably graduated from high school 50 pounds heavier than when I entered, just because, you hit going through puberty and all that stuff. So I have to imagine that plays a factor in these wrestlers' weight classes. Like if they're in one when they're starting as a freshman, how do they, like, is there anything they can be doing to kind of ease that transition as they like naturally are going to go up the weight classes just because they're growing kids?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So just to clarify, do you mean like if someone is kind of in season and they have a growth spurt, how to kind of navigate that and prepare for it? Or do you mean something a little different?
Yeah, I think, is there anything that they can be, paying attention to, if they're gaining weight either through the season or through the off season, should they be trying to, like, maybe the off season's a good spot to be thinking when they want to switch. So just any thoughts around that?
Yeah. So I guess a few things. So it's really hard to predict when someone's going to have a growth spurt, unfortunately. So, if you have one in the season, that obviously does make the cutting process a little harder. But if you're in the off season, and you're kind of trying to pick that weight class, I guess the thing is, it really depends. Sorry, I'm trying to think that question through. Yeah, it just really depends on the individual. But always, I think, trying out the process and seeing where you can get to in the off season, with what your current weight and what your current height is probably going to be the easiest way to go about that. Because like we said, when you're not as rushed, when you're not preparing for those weigh-ins as much, you can kind of trial the process out, kind of see where you can get weight-wise as far as, using the right approach to making weight and cutting, and then just kind of be more prepared for when the season does come.
Got it. So it sounds like using the off-season to be able to do some trial runs. I certainly know that, or recognize that making a change during the season may be a little stressful because you have limited time. You're already kind of in the swing of things. You got plenty of other stuff to worry about, that's for sure. So it sounds like being able to use this kind of off-season time, that if somebody wanted to try something different and be able to see where their weight could get to, maybe try out a different weight class, that now could be a good time, a little more low pressure to be able to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, there's usually, typically wrestlers are weighing in less, even if they are competing in tournaments. And exactly like you said, just not having that stress and that overbearing thought of how you're going to perform and how you're going to make weight when you're trying something new. I think that goes leagues into, being able to practice something and be successful and perfect it. And then that way, when you do have that match or that tournament coming up, like you are 100% ready to go, fired up, and there is no guesswork in it at all.
Yeah, that sounds nice. That sounds great. All right, Jackie, that was all the questions that people had written in. I see a couple of people commenting in the Facebook group. Let's see. I see Thomas, Anthony. Thanks for jumping in. Sarak asks, how can I help my daughter deal with bloat and making weight?
So that's a good question. So with female wrestlers in specific, there's kind of a few different things that you have to think about. So kind of that like variable that is a little confusing is kind of when female wrestlers do have their periods and their hormones are fluctuating. That can certainly cause some of that bloat. But we kind of tackle that the same way. Obviously, we look at those hormones and those other factors on an individual level to make those recommendations. But other than that, just again, things like that we incorporate in the Roman protocol. So those low sodium diets, that low residue diet, and that hyperhydration process are all things that are going to help flush that intracellular water out of the body. And that would certainly help with that bloating process as well.
Got it. So let me see. So I see somebody asking, let's see. If somebody wanted to work with you, how much time does it take to get this implemented? If somebody wanted to come on board and they're like, hey, you know what, I'm sick and tired of doing all the traditional methods of starving, sweating, spitting, all the things you mentioned, how much time does it take to implement the Roman protocol?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So from when we would start working with someone to when they would actually have a plan and be able to trial it out, that can typically be done in as little as 3 to 4 days. So as long as we can kind of get all the information we need from an individualized standpoint, get to know your wrestler, obviously a lot of details about their height, their weight, their training regimen, we can kind of put that together for you so you can get started right away. And then the other part of the program is we actually teach you how to do all of that yourself successfully so you can reproduce those results and use this for the rest of your wrestler's career. But just to get started, typically 3 to 4 days is when you can start trialing this stuff out.
Got it. I see a few people asking about what it costs. Like if somebody was to engage with you, like what's a process to be able to learn this and get your help in order to implement it? What sort of investment are they looking at?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So the 12-week program that I typically take wrestlers through is about $2,400, but again, it does depend on a few different factors and individually what your wrestler would need. So typically about $2,400, but that can vary.
Got it. So you mentioned a 12-week program, but that they can start getting it implemented within just a couple of days. So are you tweaking things along the way? Like what's how's that work?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So yeah, like I said, we'll fast track people through whatever they need. And in that sense, it's kind of like we're going to give you a plan just to get started so that you can see results. But what we're actually doing during that 12 weeks is so much more. Meal plans and stuff like that, they don't work in the long term. So what we're actually doing is any wrestler or any family that I work with, I teach them this process, frontwards and backwards. So regardless of if their weight changes, your wrestler's specific food preferences, they have to bump up or bump down, you guys can still be successful in that area.
So it sounds like you're really giving them the tools to be able to take like, hey, like this is going to be a critical or an integral part of your training protocol for the rest of your career, it sounds like.
Yeah. And, not everyone, but most wrestlers that I speak to, they do have aspirations to not only continue wrestling throughout all of high school, but continue wrestling through college or even just, have other higher aspirations like MMA or being an Olympian. So for a lot of people, this process is going to help them not only for the next coming season, but for the next 3, 5, or 7+ years. So that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of goals and how this process can be different for them.
Awesome. So somebody's asking, why, like, what is the Roman protocol and like, why isn't it streamlined or standard practice in the wrestling industry?
Yeah. So I kind of have a few theories about this. The first thing that kind of comes to mind is, fortunately, wrestling is a sport that is rooted in a ton of tradition, and typically most coaches, most people really involved in this field are people that wrestled themselves 20, 30 years ago. And most people, and by no means their fault, they only know the traditional methods because that's what they were taught. So that's what they continue to teach. And kind of the way the Roman protocol works and why a lot of people haven't necessarily heard of it is because it's actually something that I developed myself. You know, there's not a lot of nutrition experts or dietitians that work specifically with wrestlers. So this is actually something that I've put together myself through a lot of education, a lot of trial and error. You know, one of my first experiences with wrestling was with a collegiate wrestling team. And that's where we kind of put a lot of the principles that I currently use into practice. And over the last few years of kind of experiencing that and tweaking it and working with it is kind of how we've created that Roman protocol process.
So it sounds like if they're using it at the collegiate level, that this is something that they may be expected to do, or maybe something that only some of the best teams have access to, or that are using right now.
Looks like you guys might have lost me on your end, or I might have lost Grayson. So let's just give it one quick second to see if this comes back for us.
All right. I can hear you loud and clear if it's coming through for you. Good old internet. All right, we'll give it a second and see if we can get Jackie back on here. All right. Not sure if she's able to hear me.
Okay.
Sorry, guys. Thanks for sticking with us. Go ahead and just pause for a second. If you guys got more questions, we may get cut off today. Oh, looks like we lost Jackie. So sorry about that. It looks like the internet isn't going to cooperate with us. Maybe she's coming back.
Okay, there we go.
Good to have you back, Jackie.
Thanks. That was funny. It looked like I lost you, but I guess you guys actually lost me. Sorry about that.
No problem. We could hear you just fine. So yeah. So sorry. We were just discussing that you developed this Roman protocol while working with a collegiate team. So it sounds like, you know, colleges are typically like pretty cutting edge. Like, would you say this is like standard practice at that level, or is this still something that's, you know, only like the cutting edge teams are using?
No, this process is definitely something that's really, really new. That's kind of just coming into the field. And, you know, the more I work with people, the more I think in the future, it's probably going to become a little more standardized. But right now, this is, I would say it's definitely what you would say cutting edge in terms of research and implementation, and that there's not too many people currently doing the process the way that it's being taught.
Got it. Sounds like we have a kitty cat joining us. I love that. I work from home too, so I get to enjoy those things too.
Oh yeah, he's trying to break into the office right now.
I like it. So if teams aren't using this, it sounds like they're gonna, like, I imagine this would give them a pretty competitive edge before this becomes like a mainstream sort of process.
Yeah, no, I would think for anyone, you know, not only the weigh-in process and kind of how it helps wrestlers, but there's a big strength and performance component that comes with doing the Roman protocol. So I would say absolutely, you know, I think that people that do start implementing this right away, they're going to have a huge, not only mental edge, but there's going to be a huge strength and energy and performance edge as well.
Awesome. So I see Anthony asking examples of off-season meals to maintain weight. Do you have any go-to meals that you can recommend, or any resources to point people to?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It so depends on your wrestler's weight class and kind of what their goals are. So if they're still heavily training, then we're going to have certain more carbohydrate heavy based times of where we're going to incorporate those meals. So there's really no one size fits all. I do have a number of recipes and resources that kind of go over the different phases of training and when you should incorporate what. So I'll actually post a link to that and those blog posts as soon as we're done, just as an extra resource.
Awesome. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions popping in. So before we wrap, if somebody wants to learn more about you, the Roman protocol, you know, potentially integrating this into their training regimen, you know, where should they go? How should they reach out? How should they find out more?
Yeah, no, for sure. So I always direct people. So my website and how I work is through nutritiononthemat.com. And if you just go to that website, there will be a link for a free training that I'm hosting a few times. That's coming up, and it kind of goes over exactly what the Roman protocol is, how it's implemented, and what results that people can expect from it. So I think that would be a really great place to start to learn more.
Got it. So once they can check that out, and then it'll direct them where to go from there if they're interested in learning more.
Exactly.
Awesome, Jackie. Well, I really appreciate you being on today. I think this is a huge help. I'm excited for all the wrestlers that are going to be able to implement this. It just sounds like you're offering an amazing service and a great alternative to some pretty nasty cutting techniques that just don't sound like any fun at all. So we can go and wrap for the day. Any last words before we sign off?
No, I think we pretty much covered it. I always tell people off season, best time to prepare and learn and trial this stuff out. And if you guys want to be successful in the season and in those upcoming tournaments, now is really the time to start putting these practices into place.
I love it. Awesome, Jackie. Well, thank you so much for being here today. We'll go ahead and wrap, and we'll see you guys next time. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
See you guys later.